You know how you watch a preview, a trailer for a film, and you kind of get a sense for the whole movie without actually watching the whole movie? You only see like the most epic scenes ever, right? This is like the sneak peek of your career story. Just enough so that your attention is there, that you want to know more, but also not enough that you spoil all the details. Okay, so I've been on enough hiring committees to know that everyone's answer to the very same tell me about yourself question can actually be wildly different and make very different impressions. See, 2 weeks ago, you and I talked about the first part of the process, which is the strategy, including targeting the organization, priming them for your career stories, and anticipating their questions, needs, and concerns. So, we talked about all these in terms of kind of brainstorming. What's the strategy that we want to implement as we draft our tell you or tell me about yourself question? So, today, let's go ahead and draft your response. What we're going to do first is work through each piece. And then afterwards, you can grab an example in the description. I'm going to go ahead and link it so that you can take that example and write your own. Okay, so let's start with the very first part. Well, actually, you know what? Let me start with one piece right before we get into each of the sections. You should know before we get started that there's actually more than one form of organization taking place as we go through each of these sections. The first form of organization is chronological. As you share your tell me about yourself response, you'll notice that we're going to go from beginning to end. Think about it as a storyline, the beginning being the moment that your interest in this particular position was sparked, which is going to be, by the way, spoiler alert, well before you actually saw this job posting. And you're going to start there and walk them through all the way to the happily ever after, which is you working at that company. That's the first form of organization. The second way that we're going to organize this is going from big picture, then getting into the details, and then going back to big picture by providing an encompassing thought. Think of this as when you give a speech. I think I talked about this last time. You always tell them what you're going to tell them, and then you tell them, and then you tell them what you told them. So it's the same thing. You're going to give an introduction, a number of details, and then an all encompassing thought, kind of like the moral of the story. And at every single level, you're going to give them something to chew on, whether it's how your interest was sparked, how you're aligned with the organization, how you meet their requirements, your evidence of outcomes, answers to potential questions, and addressing any anticipated desires or worries, concerns, etc. So now that you have that, let's get into it. All right, up first, your name. Always, always, always take every opportunity to say your name. And I say this because it's so important that you repeat your name. Did you know that in order for you or anybody really, to make a purchase from a particular brand, let's say a toothpaste brand or a shampoo brand, a soda, a new type of, I don't know, dine in meal experience, you need to see the brand and have an interaction with the brand with at least 8 touch points. That's a lot of touch points. Well, it's the same thing with your professional brand. You want to help their name become familiar with you. Now, they're already going to have a touch point with your name on the resume, on the application itself, maybe on your LinkedIn, right? So you want to continue to add those repetitions up. So start off by repeating your name, and that's going to help them to link your name with your face, but also with your experience. Okay, number one, your name. Number two, tell them a little bit about what sparked your interest. Now, there's 4 different ways you can do this. Maybe there's more, but there's 4 I'm going to tell you about right now. The first one is a buildup. Maybe you thought about this career field way back when. And as you went through different positions, you realize what you really like about every single one of those positions happens to be a function or a tool or a method or a skill that all comes together in this particular position. Now, option B, you can show a spark in your interest by talking about love at first sight. From the very first time I heard about this function at such and such conference, I knew this is what I had to do. Option C, you can also talk about a childhood event. This is your typical, I knew I was meant to be in sales ever since I put up my very first lemonade stand and I talked my next door neighbor into buying my entire inventory. Just recently, this was ignited in me. Or if you're not doing a career change, you can say, ever since then, I've been in sales, I have thrived, and now I'm here because I want to go to the next level. Okay. And then there's option D. This is your recent realization. This is for career changers in particular when you realize, my entire career history, I've been working in X function. And I took the time to think through my values, think through my skill sets, think through how I want to provide the most possible value for the next 5, 10, or 15 years. Or you might say for the rest of my career. That might be a little bit safer. So you're going to share that. And that's going to let them know whether you go with option A, B, C, or D, or a different way to express how your interest in that position was sparked. What you're doing is you're creating a human connection. You're helping them to see a side of you that's a little bit deeper than requirements and outcomes and accomplishments. You're going beyond the checklist to make a connection more on a desire, a joy, more of those intrinsic, motivating type um, factors. Okay. And while we're talking about intrinsic motivation, you're also showing them that you are going to be naturally driven to thrive in this space because it's not just a job for you. It's something that you've thought deeply about and that resonates with you as a person, not just the I've got to get a job and I've got to make money version of you, but like the real, true, genuine, deep in your bones version of you. The last thing this will do is this is going to give them something that's a little bit different from the usual. And because it's in story format, it's usually like a fun story or something human. It's going to be more memorable. Okay, so number one, name. Number two, how was your interest in this position sparked? Then you move on to the big picture. Think about, number of years you've been in this function or in this industry, the different industries that you've operated in, the core outcome you provide, or the core problem you solve. In essence, what you're doing is you're aligning your one thing with the one thing they need done. That's your big picture. Now, from here, we're going to jump into the bulk of the tell me about yourself response. And this is your career story, and really not your full career story. This is like the sneak peek of your career story. You know how you watch a preview, a trailer for a film, and you kind of get a sense for the whole movie without actually watching the whole movie. You only see like the most epic scenes ever, right? Maybe an epic scene about the beginning of the movie, an epic scene about the middle, and an epic scene about the end, just enough so that your attention is there, that you want to know more, but also not enough that you spoil all the details. That's exactly what we're doing. And so when you give your career story preview, you're going to go probably as you expected in chronological order from beginning to end. But you're not going to include every single detail. You're not going to include even every single position. For some people, it might make sense to include all their positions. For others, if you had a really long career history with a lot of positions, it might make sense to only do the last 3 or 4. For other people that have had a very diverse kind of, it's less of a straight line, more of a beautiful swirly, right? Or a zigzag in your career. What you can do is go through in chronological order still, but pick up the roles and career accomplishments that most relate to your next role. So that might mean that you might have, maybe you only include 3 out of 6 different positions. Okay, so let's assume now that you have chosen the positions that you want to include in your interview and the career stories that you want to include in your interview. Once you've chosen that, you're going to pick, just like the movie trailer or the preview, you're going to pick the best parts from those early positions, the best parts from those middle positions, and the best parts from your most recent positions. And what you're doing is now you have a series of hooks. So instead of sharing everything you've done in a role or giving too much detail, or giving details that are more basic, more big picture, what you're sharing is your growth and progression of accomplishments. Now, imagine that you have a red thread where the beginning of that red thread is that moment where your interest was sparked or the moment where your career began, basically the starting point of your resume. And the other end of that red thread is the magical castle, the end of the story, the fairy tale ending. And what you want to do is basically walk them through your career story, making pit stops only where relevant and sharing only the hook. That is your goal. Okay, so that is your career story preview. It's going to sound something like During my time at a company, I was able to XYZ. From there, I went over into B company, and at B company, I had the honor of ABC, right? It's going to sound something like that. Of course, you want to change the phrasing, but you kind of get the gist. Okay, once you're done with that part, then we're going to move on to very clearly anticipate and address any questions, desires, worries, or concerns that they might have. Now, as you're doing this, know that some questions, desires, worries, and concerns might be appropriate to anticipate and address like full on and very directly. Maybe there is a desired qualification in the job posting that they want a specific tool. You can absolutely address that head on. But sometimes, for example, the worries and concerns tend to be something you don't want to address head on. We talked in the last episode. This was the one 2 weeks back where we talked about the interview strategy. We went through questions, desires, worries, and concerns, and we talked about the undercurrent being more important than the surface level worry and concern. When we think that there's a surface level worry and concern, like for example, a career gap, or last episode, what we talked about was the age piece, right? Oh, I feel like my age is going to impact. You definitely do not want to bring up your age. But instead, what's the undercurrent is, does this person have the stamina? Is this person going to be here for a while? Those types of things. That's the undercurrent. If you have a career gap, you don't want to bring up explicitly the career gap because that's like the surface level. The real concern is really underneath that. That real concern is basically, what has person been doing since then? Have they forgotten some of the technical skills needed for this role? And so, what you can do instead of saying, well, I've had a career gap, but here's why, you don't mention the career gap at all. You can just say, and in the last year, I've been learning blah, 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 blah. Or you could say, I've also been learning XYZ. The last several months have been really enlightening, and I know that I want to bring that to this organization. Okay, so we talked a little bit about anticipating and addressing those questions, desires, worries, and concerns based on the undercurrent, like what are they really interested in, and being able to share that. But also think about both what's been expressed, whether it's through the job posting or maybe you talk to the recruiter during a screening, but also what might be assumed. And so sometimes there's some assumptions that can be made in this interview process if they don't have all the information. So consider what might be assumed, if anything, and go ahead and address that without necessarily bringing it up as a bad thing, but just sharing a couple words similar to how we did with the age piece and with the career gap. Now, from here, we're going to go to an encompassing thought. This is section 6. Think of this as the moral of the story. What's the lesson that we can learn? Do you remember the Animaniacs? Am I the only one that watched that as a kid? When they were like, wheel of morality, turn, 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 tell us. Okay, no, just me. Okay. So, anyways, at the end of the story, you want to share the moral, the lesson learned. This is your encompassing thought. So, how do you do that? If you have a straight line career history, what you can do, which is really powerful, is put together a cumulative outcome. If you've been in sales your entire career, you can share the amount of revenue that you have garnered over the year across multiple positions in multiple companies. If you have maybe an editing career and you've been editor for multiple positions across multiple years, you can literally add up an estimation of all of the pages, right? Or maybe all the words, and you're like, okay, here's my resume. And in my resume, position A says X number of words, X number of pages, position B, position C, and you're adding all that up. Now, this is not necessarily going to be like a hard and fast requirement or something they're going to ask on your application. But what it's doing is it's painting a picture for them of just how much experience you have in this space. Now, it's possible that you haven't had a straight line career, right? That is less and less common nowadays. And so, the other thing you could do is look for your biggest accomplishment, your notable feature, and mention that sort of as a claim to fame. Maybe you have set up procedures for Fortune 50 companies, or maybe you helped bring about and garner adoption for a global product. Now, remember to check that what is really impressive in one environment or in one setting or to people in one industry might not be as compelling to the people you're actually speaking to. So consider two things. The first thing is this accomplishment compelling and relevant to the position I'm applying for and to the people who will be listening? That's the first one. The second thing to consider is it might be really compelling, but not easily understood. So, for example, if the company you used to work for has a terminology that is like their own, this happens a lot with awards. If you're like the highest, the person who had, I don't know, the highest sales revenue, they might call it I'm going to say something weird here. They might call it like the Quacking Duck Award. I don't know, right? And it's so prestigious at company A, but with them, they have no idea what that means. And so you might need to rephrase or rename your accomplishment using descriptors that are accurate, but will be easily understood by the person who is listening to you. Okay. Um, did I really say the quacking duck? I'm a little loopy today, clearly, with the more, what is it? The Animaniacs and the Quacking Duck. Okay, let's move on from that. Okay, so last thing you can do here, something that's really helpful. I actually learned this from Matthew Pollard. I talk about his book all the time. It's called The Introvert's Edge to Networking. Now, this is not about networking, but the idea that he talked about kind of inspired this thought here that you can end with basically like your tweetable phrase. And in this, he calls it a unifying message. So he calls himself the rapid growth guy. Basically, he is in sales, right? And so he helps grow your revenue. And I might have that incorrect, but the point is, he calls himself the rapid growth guy. What you can do is figure out your unifying message or your tweetable phrase, right? Who are you in a way that describes your function and also describes the outcome that you bring. And what you can do is basically use this as the last part of your encompassing thought to let people know over the years, I've become known as blank. And it just pretty much encapsulates in their mind who you are and the value you bring to their space. Okay, final thing here. Once you finish up with that encompassing thought, that moral of the story, then you always, always, always want to position yourself at the company. There's a difference between coming across as someone who might be a good fit for the company and coming across as someone who already believes they're in the company. So you always want to position yourself within the company. So that means that at the end, you want to mention their name, their team, and how you together can meet their needs and reach their goals. And when you talk about their needs and their goals, sometimes we get hung up because we're like, well, I don't really know what the needs and goals are because I haven't actually learned very much about them. All I have is a job posting. But you can talk about their needs and goals on a very high level. Every position has a very basic need and a very basic goal. And a lot of times these are basically the same thing, right? If you're in sales, you need slash you have a goal of making more revenue, right? So what is the big picture need and goal? And you can basically say something like, I am very excited at working at company A in the blank team or whatever, company A on team A. And together, I know that you and I can increase sales and revenue, year over year. And I'm looking forward to discussing that today. Right. So the example may not be the most eloquently stated, but you get my drift. Okay. So we talked already about the fact that there are multiple forms of organization here. And let me take a quick moment here to pause and let you know that you probably want to know what this looks like start to finish, having some sort of an example. And so to speed up your process and help you get going with this response ASAP for your next interview, go ahead and grab the link in the description. It's got an example of the 7 steps and just a very quick, drafting of what it might look like. Because for most of us, it's much easier to edit than it is to create. And so I'm going to save you some time and you can go ahead and edit to your heart's desire. Okay. Now, we talked about 2 forms of organization here, right? Start to finish. So interest sparked to, happily ever after working at the company. And then big picture down to the details and down or all the way up to your encompassing thought. And then giving them something to chew on at each level, whether it's interest, alignment, values, addressing questions, etc. Hopefully by now you can see why I could not put both the strategy and the structure in that one episode 2 weeks back. That's why we only talked about strategy at the time. And so now you have an idea of not only how to strategize your tell me about yourself response, but also how to get it drafted. Now, listen, if you are hanging out with me these last several weeks, you probably noticed that we have this sort of like a series going on. And that's because I'm kind of trying something here and I would love to know your thoughts. So, this quarter, which is what March, April, and May, I'm focusing on interview topics for every single one on one that you and I have. That means every single solo episode, right? When there is no guest, I call that a one on one. It's just a meeting with you and I. So, for those episodes, which by the way are typically numbered evenly, right? I would love to know, do you find this helpful? Or would it be helpful if we continued to do this format, meaning that every other episode is a solo, just you and every quarter, the solos focus in one specific area, so then you can easily access them when you need them? So imagine that maybe you and I create quarterly series, and one quarter is on resume, the other quarter is on interview, the other quarter is on, I don't know, negotiations, right? All the while still having guests and collaborations for all of our odd numbered episodes so that it doesn't feel like you're focusing on the same topic every time. Anyways, let me know what you think. Reach out to me on LinkedIn and let me know if that has been helpful for you. And if you have a quarterly theme idea, I would love to hear it. Now, stay with me though, because our next one on one, again, when it's just you and me and we don't really have a guest on, I'm going to show you how to improve your interview without having to draft or change a single word. That's going to be episode 112 in 2 weeks, available to you on May 20th. So meet back with me here and we'll get into it. Until then, know that we're cheering you on, we're praying for you, and we'll see you on the next one. Hey, thanks for listening. I really appreciate you spending time with me today. If you found this episode helpful, please tap the 5-star review on the show's homepage in your podcast app. It would absolutely make my day, and it helps others discover the Uncommon Career Podcast. Now, to download your free career resources and learn how I help seasoned professionals land amazing offers in as little as 90 days, click on the link in the description or go to theuncommoncareer.com. Thanks again, and I'll see you on the next one.